Arcade operators fear the VCS. Nintendo trounces Atari in court, and the PS2 takes Japan by storm. These stories and a very tired Karl on this month's episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man.
What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine COVID-19 Social Distancing Edition, Volume 2. I'm Karl, and I am Skyping with my co-host Peter. Say hi, Peter.
Hi.
Excellent. So, everybody, yes, we are still on lockdown. We are still doing this. I am actually covered by a blanket right now, trying to get the sound as good as possible. If you go on our Twitter feed, you can actually see that picture. It's quite entertaining. And yes, it's all there. And this month, we will be looking at the biggest stories in and around the video game and computer industries. Biggest stories for the month of April of the years 1980, 1990, and 2000. So, but before we start up the time machine and go into the past, Peter, let's get some banter in here.
Let's get some banter in here. Dude, how are you holding up during this time of lockdown?
To be honest with you, this is the scenario where I always thought in my life if I had to do something like this, I'd be playing video games nonstop. But I have a 4-month-old daughter, so no. I teach at a university, as some people might know, so I've started classes 2 weeks ago. I'm doing everything virtual, so it's quite nice. I have breakfast with my wife and daughter in the morning, and then I look at my watch and go, ooh, I have to be at work in 2 minutes, and so I walk upstairs, turn on the computer, and log on. So it's quite cool.
Pants, and the pants are like boxer shorts or something?
No. I am still wearing pants. Now, I'm wearing shorts, but I am wearing pants. My wife told me you never know when you might have to immediately jump up for some reason, and she was probably right. So, yes, I am wearing shorts and a nice shirt every day. I mean, I'm trying to look professional, even though my hair is looking crazy because I haven't had a haircut in like a month and a half, but it's okay.
Just take a razor and go for it, man.
I did that once when I was 5 and another time when I was 9. That was enough for me, thank you. I don't do the self haircuts. No.
Oh, hey, when we're talking about Skyping with someone that needs to see you suited up, I once had a job interview via Skype, and I was all suited up except for the pants, which were basically just shorts, and they were like my home shorts, so they were looking awful. I was really, I was totally easy about it, but as soon as the Skype call started, I was really hoping, like, for some reason, please don't ask me to stand up. I mean, why should he? But I was so afraid that this dude would just say, hey, can you just stand up a second? Good times. Hey, and if any of our listeners have any Skyping and wearing weird pants stories, we would really like to know about it. It surely will be entertaining.
We'd like to hear about it. Please don't send pictures.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Oh, no.
Well, no pictures, please.
Okay, you're on email reading duty for the next month. And speaking of that, if you do want to contact us, we're at Video Game Newsroom Time Machine at gmail.com, or on Twitter, you can get a hold of us at Video Game News R2, and we're also on the what's it called again? That thing with the pictures that all the kids are using, the Instagrams. Oh my goodness, I sound like an old man. We're also on Instagram. The links to all of that are in the show notes. But yes, back to the banter section. And how are you holding up?
Oh, pretty fine, dude. I mean, I think you've already mentioned I work in healthcare, and man, people are going nuts. People really are going nuts. I mean, at least in my hospitals, there's no COVID going on, and we don't have any patients with COVID. We don't have staff with COVID. No one knows anyone who is infected, which is a really, really good thing. But people are afraid of doing anything. That really hurts. I mean, from one hospital, the staff it was like 2 months ago. They were like, and by the time we didn't even have COVID in Germany, and they were like, we have to shut down the hospital. It's not responsible what we are doing here. And well, next week we're gonna have to shut down the hospital. So they basically get what they wished for.
Mm.
1 month. I mean, we'll reopen later, and it's all fine. But yeah.
Yeah, well, it's maybe it's better to be a little bit more cautious than not cautious enough. Just look at our good friends over across the pond.
Yeah, this is true, dude. Absolutely. But, those guys, they choose a life, working life in healthcare and know that they're needed in healthcare. Like, yeah, dude, we have to run away. And this is, man,
I hear you. I hear you.
right? I mean, I'm administration. I should be afraid. Anyhow, no, but things are good. And I mean, all the people that are still working there, I mean, they're doing it in. Some people left for sick leave, and I'm not sure whether or not they're sick, but the people that are there, and really a shout out to those guys, they are doing an amazing job, and they are really holding up, and I'm really happy they are there, and we have to get through it together.
That's the right attitude. You go and do that while I stay at home. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, but now let's... Before we jump through time, a few corrections for last month's episode. And these are, of course, thanks to Ethan of How We Play. First off, we talked about the Play-Doh system, and I misspoke when I said that they used LCD screens, when in fact plasma displays were the new types of screens invented specifically for the Play-Doh system that were used on there that gave it that nice little orange glow. Also, we talked, I misspoke, and this is all on me. Xerox didn't steal the GUI interface from Plato, as was pretty conclusively determined by Brian Deere, who spoke to Alan Kay. This can all be found in Brian Deere's book, Friendly Orange Glow, which chronicles the Plato system. I've read a chunk of it, really, really good. I recommend everybody check it out. And another clarification, I said that the Intellivision doesn't have 16-bit graphics, despite having a 16-bit bus for the CPU. That was not in reference to graphics being part of the CPU, but I was actually talking about how the resolution and sprite count and color depth that we associate normally with 16-bit systems like the Super Nintendo and the Genesis were not present on this early 16-bit CPU system. And that is highlighted by something like, for example, the PC Engine / TurboGrafx 16, which was an 8-bit system but with a 16-bit GPU, giving us that color depth that really made it look like a 16-bit system, even though the core processor was still 8-bit. Okay, that is it for corrections from last episode. Back to the show. Get to the business of the day. Let's turn on the time machine and head back to April of 1980.
Swallow a book. 1980.
Welcome to April of 1980. So, Peter, what's our first story?
Let's get started. The FCC lets Mattel go online.
Shortly after the FCC's decision to change what kind of machines can plug into a TV, they are deregulating the kind of data services that the telephone company can sell. The age of the smartphone that will tell you who is calling, be able to remember numbers and send information to your computer is on its way.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, this they literally called it smartphone in the articles. It was quite cool.
They really did. This is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Now you don't remember the phone number of your friends anymore. Awesome. Way to dumb down
This is true. This is true.
The FCC, we talked about it when they were regulating what plugs into a TV, how the shielding should work and this stuff, but they are also regulating what kind of information gets through a cable.
Well, the Federal Communications Commission basically is there to regulate. Originally, they were there for the radio signals. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So, because the airwaves under U.S. law belong to the people, to the government in that sense. Now, the FCC was also the one that regulated telephone lines because, remember, the telephone company doesn't buy all the land necessary to run the cables. Okay? So when you see a telephone line going across a farmer's field, they didn't buy a part of the farmer's field to do that.
Okay, so who did it?
Well, it still belongs to the farmer, but the government forced the farmer to allow the cable to be put there.
Yeah.
And so it's really the government coming in and saying, oh, we need this. This is a service that improves the life of everybody in the country. It's basic infrastructure that is necessary, and therefore we are commandeering this territory. And I know there's specific legal language for it, but this really gets the idea across.
Do you get any reimbursement for it?
Not that I recall, no.
Really?
No. But see, what the reimbursement for people was, and the reason that this worked is that things, for example, such as if you got a telephone line, then all your local calls were free. So, for example, if you lived out in the middle of no man's land, and you got a telephone line, you could call your nearest neighbor as long as he was in the same area code and wouldn't have to pay anything for that telephone call. Nothing in addition. Now, that's very different. So our U.S. listeners will be like, well, obviously, that's how telephones work. For everybody else in the world, they're like, wait, you didn't have to pay for local phone calls? So especially back, if you look at old movies from the 80s where some teenage girl spends 20 hours talking to her boyfriend on the phone, that was something that would happen in the U.S.
Right.
In Germany, for example, you watch the minutes because each one of those phone calls, even if it was to the person in the next apartment, was costing you money.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, using the internet and whatnot up to the 2000s, you'd really watch the seconds, dude.
Well, you watch the seconds because you're also paying by the minute for the phone call. But that was also the case in the States as long as it wasn't a local phone call.
Yeah.
So as soon as it became a local phone call, it wasn't a problem. And so this was one of the compromises the phone company had to make in order to get the government to give them the power to put up all these phone lines no matter what people wanted. So, okay. And this is why you can have these lines everywhere. And they did something similar for the train companies. So when the train companies were building the first trains across the country, they didn't have to buy all the land that they put the train tracks on because it was important for the development of the country to do this.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this is why the FCC has the power over the telephone company, which at this point is still a monopoly. And because they have this monopoly power, they have a lot of money coming in from that monopoly. And it's a big deal that the FCC is suddenly allowing the telephone company to get into another business because the fear is that they will use revenue generated, money generated from the monopoly to finance other sectors and give themselves an unfair advantage over other companies like, for example, CompuServe and all these other online services that we've been talking about the last few months that have been popping up. Ma Bell would have an unfair advantage over them if they could use the money from their monopoly to finance monopolizing these new sectors. And so anytime the phone company wanted to get into a different sector, they had to get approval from the regulators and follow a bunch of rules for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what did Ma Bell do with this new deregulation?
As far as I can tell from this particular regulation, it really does only lead very, very late. It takes a while for this really to get going. But it does lead to these, voicemail services, where instead of having a separate answering machine, you now had it through the telephone line service, and caller ID, and so forth. Now, these would not become standard for most users until the 90s, but it starts to get deregulated. And probably some of that, and this is pure speculation on my part, I'm sure somebody can come up with a better answer here, but a lot of this just has to do with the fact that the phone company gets broken up around this time. And when that breaking up of their monopoly happens and the so-called baby bell companies arise, and then you get the fight over long-distance services from third parties and so forth, all of that is going to lead to a certain amount of trepidation in the introduction of new systems, and it's also going to mean that coordinating all these different companies to have unified systems that are compatible with one another is going to take a long time. And this is also why we're going to have later on with the cell phone services in the United States, it's going to take a long, long time before they decide on common standards, which was something, for example, in Europe that gets decided very early on, so the cell phones pretty much across Europe all work.
Yeah.
In the United States, you're going to have cell phones which technically only work with one provider's frequencies, and you will not be able to take the phone from one provider to another provider in the same area.
Huh.
Yeah, so that's another battle for another decade. So this is a pretty big deal. It could have led Ma Bell to basically becoming like an America Online in many ways, but again, it's going to be the breakup. It's going to be all this other back and forth, and we're going to see other companies step in to take the reins of this.
Isn't it ironic that as soon as they got some deregulation, they were basically trust busted?
Well, you have to remember at this point that antitrust suit from the government had been running for years.
Yeah.
This thing ran for years and years and years, and then it was maybe they'll break them up, maybe they won't break them up, maybe they'll just take certain things away from them. Nobody really knew what shape it was going to take, and the baby bells were basically regional companies, and so they essentially still had a monopoly on that region. And the real problem was, what do you do with those phone lines? How do you make those? Do you say that they're government property now? Do you take them away from them? Do you the control of the phone lines? And they basically ended up saying you have to give other companies access to the same phone lines, which in many ways also stopped future development and investment in the phone lines, which is one of the reasons why in the United States so many of the lines are still above ground, where even in inner cities where it would make sense to put them below ground, nobody wants to put in the money because, well, they have to make it available to all these other companies, and it just, why should I give them a benefit when I don't get anything out of it? So there's a lot of stuff that goes into this.
Oh, okay.
And I mean, in Europe, most of the telephone companies were private up until the 2000s. I mean, public. Sorry, they were public up until the 2000s, which meant that money was no concern, and there was a certain amount of what's best for society as opposed to how do we make a profit in their decision making.
Well, makes sense to a certain degree, but again, in Germany, we didn't have really up to today, we don't have a really considerable internet speed, so maybe not the way to go.
Well, this is true, but then again, the German telephone company is no longer a public institution, so that may also have a role. Just as internet was coming in, they were turned private.
Right.
So now the argument might be the reason we have shitty internet is because the private companies saw no reason to invest.
True story, man.
Yeah,
True story.
yeah. Whereas a government-run organization could have said, this is our new goal, we need to do this, and boom, it would have happened.
Mm-hmm.
But we will now never know. Oh, well, okay. Moving on to a slightly different topic.
Mm-hmm. And backwards-oriented people. The Luddites are back, and they're wearing berets.
Yes, berets.
Okay.
A series of attacks on computer centers in France have been perpetrated by anarchist groups. Their goal was to destroy records as they see the computers as tools of control by the elite. The groups admit that they have computer professionals in their ranks. The group, Action Directe, has claimed responsibility, proving it with a picture of a manager's desk. So,
we are in your home, man.
yeah, and the funny part was that the manager's desk had I believe it was a Rolls-Royce catalog in the drawer. It's kind of be like these bourgeoisie son of a bitches. But yes, so
you think it was a setup?
It was definitely an inside job. That is true. So it was somebody working there who knew how the machines worked and could tell them, where to go and where to attack to get the damage that they wanted to create. And
so did they smash the machines, or did they someone hack them?
I didn't think they hacked them. I think it was more of a smashing. But you have to remember, at this point in time, when you're talking about mainframes of this size, smashing really is the only way to destroy the data. I mean, if you put in a routine to delete it, you'd have to let it sit there for 3 hours or something. I mean, so
destroy you in 2 weeks, man.
Well, also remember, a lot of these systems at this point are still running on massive wheels of tape, so they're not always attached to the machine.
Oh.
They're being stored on a shelf someplace, and you only take them off when you need them.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's storage, data storage at this point is still a very different ballgame. But so these groups of attacks go on for a little while. I've got a link to the Wikipedia page for Action Directe. They were one of the many sort of terrorist quasi-communist groups that were active in Europe at the time. Germany had the RAF and stuff. And so it was that period in late 70s, early 80s of terrorist attacks inside Europe that basically kind of died down by the end of the decade. But it was kind of funny just to see this, and I was like, okay, that's different. But yeah. So they did not succeed. We are all controlled by machines, and next month we're actually going to see how the French government is taking this to a whole new level. But that's a story for next month.
All right. Foreshadowing yet.
Foreshadowing, yes. Big news coming out of France next month. Okay.
Talking about big news, Warner, Mattel, and Coleco report record profits.
Yes, the numbers for the major players in the electronic gaming sector are all up through the roof. Coleco sees a 30% rise in sales. Warner's success is massively bolstered by Atari with their arcade business, but also a very healthy VCS business. And the future looks bright going into 1980. So...
yeah, the future looked bright. Was it though?
1980 is going to be a record year again. 1981 is going to be an even bigger record year. Video games are here. And 82 is also going to be a record year.
83?
Yeah, Not so much. 83 is going to be a bit of a problem. Just a
there's
little bit
an
of a
iceberg
problem.
on the horizon.
Yeah. There are clouds on the horizon, but in 1980, this is a juggernaut business. The handhelds are going like hotcakes. Everything is going, and there's money to be made. The tech sector is hot.
Didn't we talk about it last month that there were way too many handheld systems on the market, on the shelves?
We talked about how at Toy Fair they had literally thousands of SKUs. So thousands of new designs coming on the market, and that many of them would not end up making it. Now, the thing with these three companies, Warner, Mattel, and Coleco, all of them will end up in the console market within the next 12 months, basically. So Warner is already there through Atari with the VCS. Mattel has already been testing the Intellivision, as we talked about.
Yeah.
And Coleco is going to be launching. So if you listeners have not listened to our 2-part Michael Katz interview, you can jump over and listen to that and find out all about the launch of the ColecoVision, which is also right around the corner. And so this is why the handheld gaming market is basically going to be on the ropes within the next 24 months, with only companies like Tiger Electronics surviving. But the console game market is just now getting going, and that's the real future.
Futures now.
It's huge. But that's not. Gaming isn't the only sector of the tech market that's doing well, apparently.
No, because AMD is making it rain.
That's right. The New York Times has an interesting profile this month of Advanced Micro Devices' efforts to retain its employees. Their Christmas in May program is a profit-sharing tool handing out checks to their employees in addition to their salaries, bonuses, and stock options to keep them at the company. The Silicon Valley rush, the overall lack of skilled technical staff to develop a constant flow of new chip designs, is such that the companies are desperate to not lose any of their employees. The paper also reports that Intel's profits for the first quarter of 1980 rose by 57.5% on a sales increase of 51.7%. The numbers this industry is writing at a time when the economy as a whole seems to be floundering badly and going into recession are simply amazing. And if you add in the siren call of venture capital money, tempting young designers away to start their own competing firms, well, those checkbooks open up real fast. So yes, AMD is handing out money like it's going out of style, basically just to keep their employees there and preventing them from moving to greener pastures.
Mm-hmm. And did they keep their sheeps?
AMD is still going strong today, so yes, they did. At least they kept a lot of them. Now, this is really the beginning of Silicon Valley as we know it today. The super expensive real estate, the constant birth of new companies popping up out of the ground. And it is that mixture of venture capital that is tempting engineers and creative types away to start new ventures because, well, if you're starting it up and risking other people's money, who cares? And if it does work, the payouts are astronomical. Both for the creatives and the venture capitalists. And at this point, with the market being as hot as it is, the universities are not producing this many people. There's tons of universities at this point that if they do have a computer department, it's pretty much still stuck in the days of mainframes and not really understanding the new world of the microchip as it is very quickly evolving. So this is why the number of people who are really capable of this kind of work is relatively limited, and with the tech moving as fast as it is, there's a lot of people who are just basically getting aged out of the industry, and it's going to take another couple of years before this really takes off in such a way that the universities are producing enough people to satisfy the demand in Silicon Valley.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, creating those programs at the university surely takes time. So, yeah, sure.
Of course. And the idea of this new tech getting out there so that it can become part of the curriculum is also time consuming.
Yeah.
And so this is why it's – and also remember, we're just now leaving. It's 77 is when we have the Trinity come out, the first three big home computers. Up until this point, if you wanted to learn about computers, you had to go to one of these big institutions, which means you didn't really have teenagers learning about chip design. So this is only 3 years later that you have now the first batch of teenagers who had one of these computers at home that's starting to figure out how this stuff works in large quantities. I mean, you always had some people before that. Otherwise, the Trinity couldn't have come about. But it really is that first generation of kids growing up with the tech that are going to fuel the big revolution in the 80s. And so right now there's still that dearth of talent it's on the horizon. It's about to hit. So if you got your machine, let's say 77 or 78, you were 16 years old. By 1980, you are now in college. And if you're pursuing this, you're pursuing it not only with the knowledge that you're getting in the classroom, but you're also pursuing it with the knowledge you gain from working at home, maybe programming an assembler or whatever else. And so it's coming. It's just going to be a couple more years until these people get out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And moving on.
Yeah, speaking about up-and-coming things, game consoles are the up-and-coming thing, just not at toy retailers.
There you go. Playthings magazine, an industry journal for toy retailers, has an interesting piece on the burgeoning video game console market. Apparently, Mattel is focusing on sales through department stores for their Intellivision system, mainly due to production limitations. While the systems get a big publicity push through the New York Macy's store, a rep for the company admits that they got a request from Toys R Us for 25,000 units, but could only supply 20,000 units total for the Northeast of the United States, forcing them to say no to Toys R Us. The lack of production capability means that handheld electronics will continue to be the only real video game option for toy retailers for a while to come. But just a few pages later in the same issue, Atari has taken out a one-page ad promoting the VCS as the soon-to-be biggest seller in toy stores. Considering that the retail price for the system with the pack-in combat game has dropped to just $80, while the Intellivision is retailing for $300, this kind of makes sense.
Mm.
So, and this is an interesting parallel. The first year or two of the VCS being on the market, the toy retailers really didn't want to touch it. It was too expensive. It was something they weren't familiar with. They didn't want to take a risk on it. And now suddenly Mattel, one of the biggest toy companies in the world, is bypassing the retailers they traditionally work with, in large part because they just simply cannot produce the numbers the toy retailers want to see. And so they're just ramping up their production. They're not used to building electronics in this size and sophistication either, so it's taking them a long time to get the product up and running. But at the same time, it doesn't even seem like they're all that enthused to go into the toy retail space, But you kind of get the feeling that toy retailers realize, hey, wait, we may have missed the boat on this for 2 years. There's money to be made with these game consoles. We need to get in on this. And we don't have a relationship with Atari. We don't know Atari from any other products. But Mattel, we know. We understand Mattel. Mattel understands us. This is a party that we should be doing business with, and we can't, and this kind of sucks. And Atari now has to build those bridges, build those relationships with the toy retailers that they haven't built previously.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I'm wondering why Mattel is focusing on sales through department stores. I mean, they could as well have focused on sales through toy stores, couldn't they?
Well, and this is something where it's a little hard to imagine today because the traditional department store, when I say department store, and you can call a lot of things a department store. Theoretically, a Walmart is a department store.
Yeah, I was thinking of stores like a Walmart.
Yeah, that's not the department store we're talking about here. Okay. At this point in the United States, when we talk about department store, we're talking the more upscale. The example in Germany would be Galeria Kaufhof or Karstadt.
We have everything store.
We have everything store with very nice departments, and the people come out to talk to you and walk you through the product and so on and so forth. And these department stores are not necessarily going to carry the mass quantities. They're also not going to discount the product. They're not looking for the cheapest version of the product.
Yeah. And
these department stores give you a little bit more cachet. So if you're bringing a machine to the market that costs $300, you're already saying this has to be a product that only the more well-to-do person can afford.
And those guys go shop at Toys R Us.
And Toys R Us is the place where you go to buy a quick present for your kid. It's a big, giant store, but it's not the fancy store. You know, you're grabbing it off the shelf. You don't have a salesperson coming over to you to ask you. It's a self-service thing. And in the department store, you know, you've got the big, nice, fancy television sets, not your cheap little TVs. And that's where they're trying to sell this device.
Well, this is really interesting. I mean, because at least I have the impression that consoles in the United States are seen more as a toy than as something an adult would buy for him or herself. And it started earlier with the department stores. There are shops that adults go to buy stuff for themselves, you know?
Not necessarily. And especially around Christmas time, back in the 70s and 80s, all the department stores typically did not have toy sections, or if they did, it was very, very small toy sections. But at Christmas time, they would convert huge chunks of the real estate of the store into toy sections.
Okay.
And so they would carry a lot of toys around Christmas time. So it's not surprising that a department store would be the place where you would want to sell a high-end piece of electronics. I mean, if you were back in the 70s, if you wanted to buy a video recorder, you would probably go to one of these department stores to buy it as well. It wouldn't be uncommon for you to buy a big, expensive television set or a video recorder or a hi-fi system in a department store back then.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I would go to a Radio Shack or some of those kind of stores, you know.
Well, the Radio Shack back then was primarily a place for small electronic components, if you were building your own radio, for example, or little RC cars and things like that. The fact that they were also selling computers was only a side effect of the fact that they were selling all the components to build a computer.
Okay.
Yeah. And so just selling the finished computer was an easy extra step.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And we talked about that, I believe, in December of 2018 episode where there was a profile on founder of Radio Shack, or the son of the founder of the Tandy Corporation, who had just passed away. So if you go back through our archives, you can listen to that. And in that, we also talked a lot about the history and the development of the TRS-80 and how it literally was that development. But the idea here is these department stores were the place where you could charge $300 for an item and it wouldn't be all that surprising. And especially because Macy's, for example, was the high-end department store. And by putting it in the high-end store, that got you on the media, it got you on television, and it was a prestige thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Mattel is getting into the game. Atari desperately wants now into the mass toy retailers.
Mm-hmm.
And that might bring a problem with itself.
You think so?
Just maybe.
Just maybe. Want me to move on? Arcade game operators fear the VCS.
A bit of a kerfuffle has ensued over Atari's promotion of Space Invaders for the VCS. And no, it's not from companies selling Space Invader clones on home computers, but from coin-op operators. Atari launched an ad in Consumer Electronic Trade publications ahead of CES in Las Vegas, saying that they are doing everything they can to get those long lines of people out of the arcades and into retailers' stores. A group of operators out of Minnesota has sent a strongly worded letter to Ray Kassar, the head of Atari, to complain about this and are questioning Atari's commitment to the coin-op industry. So,
was Atari committed to the coin-op industry, man?
Ray Kassar was only committed to wherever he could make some money. The idea here was Ray Kassar had signed a deal with Taito I believe with Midway, because they were the distributors in North America. They had signed the deal to be the exclusive rights holder to Space Invaders for the home. For home systems. And we talked about this in a previous episode. Now, the idea with that, of course, was, hey, this is the big hit. This is what everybody loves to play in the arcade. If we can bring it home, that's going to sell a lot of VCSs. And they were right. A ton of people buy the VCS just to play Space Invaders. It was that much of a hit, and it was that important of a game. Now, a system seller. Now, at the same time, those masses of people were also a lure for the toy companies, the toy retailers, to start stocking the VCS. You know, the argument of why should I sell this expensive piece of equipment in my toy store? Well, it's because we can get this line of people that used to be at the arcade lining up at your store. And the problem with that, of course, for them is going into the Consumer Electronics Show is that this ad did not show up in the trade publications for the coin-operated machine people, the people who ran arcades and were buying Atari's arcade cabinets. Instead, why should it? It was showing up in the trade publications for the people who ran retail stores selling electronics. Yeah. But when these coin-op operators saw this, they were like, hey, wait a second. If they're going to start porting our big hits, our moneymakers, to the home console, well, if the line isn't at the arcade anymore, then the line isn't at the arcade and there's no money coming into us. Is Atari basically telling us that they're abandoning us and they only want to go to the consoles? And Ray Kassar really doesn't care one way or the other, I don't think. He's obviously saying that, you know, the two things are parallel. They're not going to kill each other. But it's hard to argue that there isn't going to be some effect here.
But dude, isn't it a little bit naive from the coin operators? Like, Atari, you belong to us and you shouldn't make your money somewhere else.
Well, yes and no. The problem is, though, that it's similar to movie theaters and video on demand nowadays, or streaming. That, yeah, the movies come out on Netflix and so forth, but they don't make as much money on Netflix as they do in the theaters. There's a reason why right now during the COVID scare, where all the movie theaters are closed, Disney is sitting on the next Marvel movie. We're recording this in April of 2020. The next Marvel movie is Black Widow. They've already put out the advertisements for it. The movie was supposed to be coming out very soon. They've delayed it indefinitely, or they moved it to the end of the year. They could have just brought it out on Disney Plus, on their streaming service, which is what they've done with, and they're going to do with Artemis Fowl, some young adult fiction movie. But they're not going to do it. And the reason they're not going to do it is there's too much money that would be left in the movie theater. They wouldn't generate that much more in subscription fees from putting it on Disney Plus.
No, they don't lose anything by waiting, so totally makes sense.
Well, they lose a lot. Remember, they've already spent God only knows how many millions on advertising worldwide, and they're going to have to do it again when the movie comes out.
That's called sunk cost.
Well, sunk cost is still lost money, okay? No matter how you want to cut.
Either way, I mean, they've run the advertisements going to be in the movie theater, so it's not.
Of
whatever
course.
they do, it's not. So whatever.
Of course. So the big problem here is that if you're going to design a game and you want to make as much money off of it, you're not going to bring it out directly onto the console. You're probably going to put it in the arcade first, and vice versa. What the operators here, I think, might be overestimating is the quality of the VCS ports. I mean, Space Invaders on the VCS doesn't look as good as Space Invaders in the arcade. And the other thing is also Space Invaders is already kind of old hat by this point. We talked last month about Galaxian is already on its way, which is adding a bunch of new features to the Space Invaders mold. And very soon we're going to have Galaga, and all these other games are coming down the pipeline. The games are evolving very quickly, and the VCS is not going to be able to keep up with them.
No.
But what the VCS is going to be able to do is offer very different types of games. Once we get games like Adventure and Pitfall, these are games that don't really work in the arcade the same way they work at home, because they require longer individual play sessions. And it's not just about kill you as fast as possible to get another quarter.
Right. And I think also what the coin-op operators totally underestimate is the entire experience they are selling. I mean, they're not only selling the game, they are selling this standing there with guys watching you while you play and, dropping in, dropping out, this stuff. And you just can't have this at home. And I think Space Invaders is a game which is totally fitting this environment, the
idea of the prestige and the camaraderie and all of that is definitely an aspect that I think in some ways the internet play was the final death knell of the arcade later on in the late 90s, early 2000s. That's when the arcade finally starts to die.
Sure, because in the arcade I can't say F you, you little B. I don't say it. No. And it's easy said in TeamSpeak or type down. So
yes, because when you actually have to look another person in the face, you have an automatic sense of civility, which you don't have when you're just trolling on the internet.
Exactly. There are a whole lot of interesting studies about it.
Yes. Oh, I know. There's a reason why I don't play any online games. Not just because I'm old.
Are actually cursing about you more often now that they don't have to look you in the eye?
That is an excellent question that I do not have the answer to, and I hope never to have the answer to. So let's leave it at that.
Let's leave it at that and move on.
Yeah, saying in the coin-ops, yes. Sorry. Saying in the coin-ops.
Staying in the coin-ops, inflation grips the arcade industry, and the industry fights back.
Oh, yes. Inflation is hitting double digits across America, and the Fed is raising interest rates to match. What is an arcade operator to do? Well, buy a mediocre game with an expensive loan and hope that enough single quarter plays trickle in? Wait weeks or months for one of those super hot asteroid games that may never show up, or worse, miss the fad? Or should the wise operator buy Bally's new Space Invaders and Williams's Firepower pinball machines that are not now introducing 50-cent play? The pinballs in question will also take Susan B. Anthony $1 coins, but these are so scarce as to not really be viable. In a sign of the technological state of the art, the different coins still require different slots on the cabinets. So,
what is a Susan B. Anthony $1 coin?
Oh, okay. Susan B. Anthony, famous suffragette, and they put her on a coin, a $1 coin in the 1970s, I believe, and it was sort of the attempt to do what had already been done a long time ago in Europe, which was to have larger denomination coins. So traditionally, the largest coin in the United States was a quarter. 50-cent coins had also existed off and on, but always in small numbers. And the idea here with the massive inflation that was happening at this time, that the dollar was going to drop so much in value that it didn't make sense to have it as a bill anymore, to just use coins. Basically, the dollar was going to be change. And a lot of people resisted it, and in many ways you could argue from an economic standpoint that the psychological effect of keeping the dollar as a bill actually helped increase the value of the dollar.
Yeah.
That you never really lost the value of it because it was paper money. The moment you start using coins, you lose the value, the mental value.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, well, not of course. I mean, because look at your European currency. The euro, when it launched, was more valuable than the dollar, and yet they still launched with 1 and 2 euro coins.
Oh, yeah, but we are used to 1 and 2 nominal value coins. But
Exactly.
the dollar is always a bill, so sure, you devaluate everything below the dollar is what you give to your kids and you find in your pocket, man.
Exactly. You know? So coins are something that basically get lost in the pillow cushions on the sofa, and this is why the Susan B. Anthony dollars were never minted, in large enough quantities to really be effective in the arcades. And so, that's this was their big hope. When you read through the trade magazines of the time, like Replay magazine, for example, and Play Meter, they're constantly talking about, if we just had these coins, we could start charging more for the games, and
they just charge 4 quarters or
well. Yes, but there's a psychological effect when you're putting in more and more coins. Exactly. If you're just putting in 1 coin, it's one action. You don't think about it as much. The moment you have 4 quarters in your hand and you got to put them in one at a time, you start to think about it more.
And when you exchange them for coin tokens?
Now that, of course, is a whole different ballgame. So, yes, a lot of the ultimate solution is going to be the token. And there's going to be a lot. Most of the arcades I ever played in the 80s and 90s were token-only arcades. And this led to things like, for example, if you put in a quarter, you got 1 token. If you put in $1, you got 5 tokens. You put in $5, you got 22 tokens or 24 tokens.
Discount.
Yeah, so you got a discount for the quantity, but obviously then you're spending a lot more money and you're not even thinking about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so this becomes their way around the token, the larger denomination coin problem.
Yeah.
But
you just have to bring coin operators to all agree on one token those machines accept?
No, because each arcade wants to control that. So, for example, imagine you're an arcade that doesn't do 5 for a dollar. And your tokens are compatible with a place that does do that. And the reason you don't do 5 for a dollar is because you spent a lot of money on brand new machines, and the one that does 5 for a quarter only has old machines. Then you're going to start getting a bunch of kids who go take $20 to the cheap arcade, and they have extra tokens to spend on yours. You don't care about getting tokens; you care about getting dollars.
Yeah, of course. But how does it work? Like, do you produce how do you start a game as a coin operator? How do you connect the token accepting kit to your arcade machine?
Well, I don't know the exact mechanism inside. I know they have a little mechanism that checks the size of the coin. And I want to say that nowadays, or in the later machines nowadays, everything is usually card-based. But in later machines...
Take out the psychology entirely.
Well, yeah. Well, usually what it is, it's a little card that's just for the company. It looks like a credit card, but it's just for that arcade, and you basically put credits on it. Okay. So each game can have a completely different valuation of credits for each play. But... the way you would do it is you would just basically adjust the size regulator inside the machine for the coins in that arcade. And also, again, if you look through these magazines, you'll see ads all over the place from companies that are just selling tokens. So these are companies that make tokens in different sizes. So you would go there, order, let's say, 50,000 tokens, all of the same size, and those become the tokens for your arcade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if any one of our listeners knows how this works, how to connect the token accepting kit to the arcade machine, I would really be interested about your feedback.
Oh, definitely. And diagrams and whatever else, always glad to see that. So, yes. But it's interesting that pinball is the first game to go 50 cents. And it's not the video. It's the pinball that goes 50 cents. The video's not going to do it until Dragon's Lair comes in 83. We still have a little ways to go yet. Yeah. Okay.
Well, someone had to start it, and then you have to monitor the market, whether or not.
Exactly. And sticking with the arcades.
Yes. Cinematronics sues Atari over asteroids.
Cinematronics has filed suit against Atari and an operator for infringement of their patents protecting the use of vector graphics in video games. The patent, part of the batch we talked about a few months ago in our January episode, which Exidy bought access to through their purchase of Vector Beam, a subsidiary of Cinematronics, covers the display of vector graphics on a vector display for the purpose of creating a video game. The case would ultimately be settled between Atari and Cinematronics out of court, according to a report in the October 15, 1981 Play Meter magazine, and dismissed with prejudice in September of 1981. One of the interesting aspects of this is the inclusion of an arcade operator as a defendant in the case. This is clearly meant to dissuade operators from purchasing the games, but is not necessarily outside of the legal limits in a patent suit, as patents are meant to prevent people from profiting from your inventions. So, and again, like I said, this is a little bit complicated on the legal side, but Cinematronics, and we talked about it a little bit in the January episode, where they were moving these two companies, Vector Beam and Exidy. Exidy bought some parts of Cinematronics, but they didn't really buy the patents. The patents basically stayed with the owner of Cinematronics, and they were just using this to sue people trying to use vector beams to make video games.
Why wouldn't Exidy also buy the patents?
Because they weren't for sale. and also because Exidy kind of thought they did. As far as I understand the story, Exidy thought that they had purchased those rights and then actually still had to pay a license fee to continue making Vector Beam games.
What the hell?
Well, it was a very clever deal. They just... You have to remember, a lot of these companies are run by tech people, and when you get somebody who's not a tech person but a business person and a shrewd one at that, they're going to start screwing people over like this.
Sure, I mean, if it's that easy.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that the vector technology was ultimately going to be a dead end no matter what. It's a technological dead end.
Oh, yeah, sure. No, we know that, but back then...
Well, back then, we talked about it last month, how Asteroids was unlike Galaxian, a game that wasn't getting pirated because the vector technology meant, well, you can't just put in an old TV set in there. And
exactly. So totally made sense. I'm just still startled that Exidy didn't buy the patents as well. I mean, hey, I am buying your shelves and your chairs, but not the stuff that's actually making up for your value. So,
yeah, but I mean, if it wasn't for sale, it wasn't for sale.
Yeah, but then you just don't. Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's just one of those things. Exidy needed more output because, remember, the arcade market is booming. They needed to be able to produce more games per year. And so picking up this existing studio with production facilities made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Cinematronics got what they wanted, which was the patents, and Exidy got the additional production capacity. And so they got sued, get settled out of court, and what I couldn't find out was what happened to the operator who was sued in tandem with Atari. And that was kind of the part that originally got me interested in the case, was the fact that they were going after an operator. And I think that only makes sense for Cinematronics because they didn't see themselves as that big of a supplier of games at this point. So they're more thinking along the lines of, we're just in it to exploit these patents, and we don't care if we piss off the people who would buy our games. Or maybe they were just having a Jack Tramiel moment where it was like, short-term profit is more important than long-term relationships with retailers and business associates, which is actually probably the case. And for more on that, listen to part 2 of our Michael Katz interview, where he talks at length about his time at Tramiel's Atari. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, plug. Okay, but let's leave the arcades behind for a while.
Let's leave them behind. TSR opens UK office.
TSR Hobbies, the creators of Dungeons & Dragons, has formed their own subsidiary in the UK. Games Workshop had, up until now, been their UK distributor, going so far as to printing their own versions of the products. An attempt by TSR to buy the company had failed, and as it was also licensing games from other manufacturers and publishing its own products, including Reaper, a forebearer of its flagship property Warhammer, which would be released in 1983. Don Tumble, a regular contributor to White Dwarf, Games Workshop's in-house magazine, would lead TSR's subsidiary. And so if you've ever seen a Games Workshop store, obviously you know that they are still around. And so this is interesting just because it really establishes one of the big gaming companies, not digital necessarily, but has led to a ton of classic computer and video games. And it really shows that TSR is getting so big, and the D&D phenomenon is so big, that they felt a necessity to get in on the European trade, at least more directly. Yeah. Now, curiously enough, and this is a small aside, and we'll probably mention it in a few years if I remember it, TSR also has a distributor in Germany that is translating the D&D product around this time. And they end up also cutting ties with them. And that leads to pretty much the only major German RPG, which is Das Schwarze Auge, the Dark Eye, I think it's called. It was also, the Dark Eye, Das Schwarze Auge. You can't say the Black Eye, which would be the literal translation, because that means something else entirely in English. But that system is really just the response of the German distributor to losing the license, and they just basically made their own version of original D&D to continue to have product to sell. So in a way, a lot of the Games Workshop product that comes out after they lose the D&D license is a response to not having that product in their inventory anymore. But at the same time, it also frees them up to be more creative and to do other things. But Games Workshop never would have been big enough to do that if they hadn't been the distributors for the D&D product to begin with. So just thought I'd mention that. And speaking of connections with D&D and strategy and whatnot.
SSI brings wargaming to the digital world.
Yes. Strategic Simulations Incorporated, aka SSI, a company that would become synonymous with complex war games and RPGs in the 80s and early 90s, is running an ad for its first game, Computer Bismarck, in this month's Creative Computing. Oh yes, and we'll get to that in just a moment. SSI was founded in 1979 by Joel Billings, and the first version of this game, programmed by John Lyon, I think Lyon or Leon, Lyon, sorry if I'm killing that, the Apple II version was released in January of 1980. This ad is for both Apple and TRS-80 versions of the game. A pretty impressive one-page ad which shows that the market for games is getting bigger and more important in the marketplace, and strategy games are a perfect fit for these early machines. Computer Bismarck was actually a take on an existing board game called Bismarck by Avalon Hill.
Create your own health insurance system.
No, this is about the battleship Bismarck in World War II. Yeah,
of course.
And the reason I know so much about this is that I recently conducted an extensive interview with Mr. Billings about the history of SSI, how the company came about, the ups and downs, the final fall, and what he's doing nowadays, which should, depending on our allotment of memory that we have on our Libsyn account, will either be released before the end of April or the beginning of May. So that's a little plug that we have we had a really nice long conversation. Billings is a super nice guy. Big time gamer, and we really had a good time talking. I think that comes out in the conversation that we had. So,
we have a whole lot of interviews lined up, haven't we?
Yes, I've also already completed my extensive interview with Wild Bill Steely. I have an interview with Larry Wagner in the can, and I got another one lined up for next week. So there's going to be interviews coming out. The only limitation we have is that we only have so much bandwidth every month. Not bandwidth, sorry. Only so many megs we can post every month.
Do you know how we can increase that?
It's funny that you should ask that. It's almost like it was planned this way. But it wasn't.
It wasn't. And
we can increase this if you help us out on Patreon. Now, I understand this is the wrong time to be asking people for money. A lot of people are out of work. So, hey, if we have to wait a few more months to get more cash on the Patreon, that would be helpful. That would be something perfectly acceptable, and I understand it. But if you can help with a buck or two,
it's what he wants
it's
to
always
say.
helpful. And we will try to make sure that you get something for it, okay? Okay, so with that being said, I think that concludes our trip back to April of 1980. Let's turn on the time machine and head to April of 1990.
Best year ever.
Yeah.
I'm not getting tired of mentioning this. You'll hear it for the next
yes,
8
I know.
months.
Yeah. Damn kids. Okay. Time machine.
You can't do that on an 8-bit system.
Welcome to April of 1990. Peter, what's our first story?
Our first story is Nintendo. Nintendo can sue retailers that carry unlicensed NES cards.
This stems from the Atari versus Nintendo suit that has been raging over Nintendo's practice of using a lockout chip to prevent unauthorized games from being released for their system. Remember, this is Atari Games, the arcade guys, selling games through their Tengen subsidiary.
Yeah.
Not Atari the computer guys who also make consoles. The initial case was filed in December of 1988, and in February of 1989, Atari got an injunction from the trial court prohibiting Nintendo from going after retailers who stock the games while the case is pending. The appeals court has now thrown that injunction out. So, this means that, similar to the Cinematronics case we just talked about, where they didn't just go after the company making the game that was infringing, but they had also included one of the operators. Here, Nintendo doesn't just want to sue Atari for making games that are violating, in their opinion, the lockout chip, but they also want to go after the retailers that sell the games. So they basically want to scare any retailers away from selling these Atari unlicensed cartridges.
Nintendo really is fond of suing other guys, isn't it?
And Nintendo, especially at this period, controlling something like 98% of the market or whatever is some ungodly amount, did not want to give up that control of the market. And, I mean, you can't blame them. Basically, they were the ones who brought the market back after the crash. And the only reason why we didn't have another crash, the only reason we didn't get flooded with cheap, terribly programmed NES games was because of their quality control and their limit on how many games a company could release every year. And, I mean, if it hadn't been for those limitations, it would have just been a shit show. And, I mean, if you look at, for example, the European home computer market, where you had a ton of super, super crappy games getting released. But there it didn't matter because the games were just a couple of bucks a pop. So if you bought 10 games and 4 of them were utter garbage, it didn't really matter that much because you still hadn't spent as much as one NES game was going to cost you. And so this is the difference. This is really how they could justify the high cost of cartridge-based software by at least telling you, you know, the game's not going to crash immediately. It's going to work. It may not be a fun game, especially if it says LJN on it, but at least it's going to work. And so, yeah, they're going after it. They want to shut Atari down, and they basically succeed at this point. And so, by being just the threat of being able to sue, I tried to look up. I couldn't find any actual cases where they sued retailers, but I think that the message was clear at this point.
Oh yeah, I think it was. And up to today, the Nintendo.
Yeah, nobody really does unlicensed games anymore. It's that fad is past, and if you did really want to produce games like without having to pay license fees, that's what Steam is for.
Yeah, or the PC in general. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that of its time, and that time has passed. But it's interesting to see that they got that injunction lifted, and that the retailers basically got pulled in. Fun stuff.
Right.
And,
dude, we have to move on. You're falling asleep, man.
it's been a long day. I taught for 6 hours today, so yeah, it's
6 hours.
Yeah, 6 hours of class today. I mean, it was two courses of legal English and then my academic reading and writing. So spent a whole bunch of time analyzing the language of the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics job report. So, yeah.
You're still awake?
I'm still awake, and I started class at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it is currently 11:13 at night as we're recording this. So I am a badass is all I'm trying to say to everybody out there.
You're me both, brother.
Yes.
I got up at 6, so. Oh, well, but you have a kid, so you don't sleep so good night, so okay.
I got the baby monitor right next to me. My wife's up there, but I still keep staring at her the whole time. So go figure.
Actually sleep?
Oh, yeah, she sleeps.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, she sleeps. I mean, she always gets at least 7 hours every night, straight through. I mean, it's amazing sometimes. Yeah.
Well, good for her. Good for you.
Yeah.
The two of you.
Sort of, yeah. Oh.
Well, no place is as relaxing as home. Speaking of
exactly.
home, the arcade is coming home.
SNK, an arcade game maker famous for games like Ikari Warriors and Athena, have announced a new arcade platform, the MVS, a 68,000 powered monster that would also be available as a home console. The console version, known as the AES, would be identical to the arcade hardware. The system would be a rental only in Japan in 1990, but then get a retail sale release in both Japan and North America in 1991. The launch price would be a mere $649 for a system with 2 controllers and a game. So, have you ever heard of the Neo Geo?
Oh, yeah.
This is the Neo Geo.
Oh, okay.
So at this point, the news articles weren't calling it the Neo Geo yet. They were talking about the MVS and the AES. And those monikers did stick for the arcade and home systems. But this is the Neo Geo. This is the system that gives us such amazing games as King of Fighters, Metal Slug, one of my all-time favorite series. Puzzle Bobble comes out on this, the first version. I mean, it's just an amazing piece of hardware, even to this day. As far as I'm concerned, there's very, very little in the way of hardware that moves two-dimensional sprites around that's any better than this. And so it comes out at this point. I remember seeing this in stores. Even before I had seen any of the games in the arcade, I saw this at a Software Etc. It was a chain of software stores back in the day, now part of GameStop. And I remember just looking at it going, that looks amazing, and then seeing the price. I mean, it was $650 for the console, but the games were like $300 a pop as well.
What?
Okay, you need to understand, a typical arcade cabinet at this point will put you back about anywhere between 2,000 and 7,000. Because you have to think about it this way. Well, no. This isn't a home console. It is the arcade hardware. So, one of my favorite YouTubers does this great series where every week he does a video called Battle of the Ports. And he shows you what the arcade game looked like, and then he shows you what the home versions of that same game look like. And those are two very scary differences, okay? So in 1990, if you are an NES player and you're going to the arcade and you're seeing a game like, let's say, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and it's got 4 players and it's got all these colors and a bunch of sprites on screen and it looks beautiful like a cartoon. And then you get Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the arcade game for your NES. And suddenly there's not as many sprites on the screen. There's only a 2-player option. The colors have been dimmed down to almost nothing. It still looks good. It still plays well, but it ain't the arcade game. Even worse, if you're a Commodore 64 owner, you get a version of the game too, but it's even more spec'd out. So we were used to the home versions of the game being inferior. And the sheer number of ROM chips in one of these Neo Geo cartridges was massive. I mean, we're talking multiples of what a Super Nintendo or Genesis game. And at this point, the Super Nintendo doesn't exist yet. The Super Nintendo is still 2 years away. The Genesis has just come out.
Yeah, but still, I mean, you can get it as a home console, right?
You can get it. In 1991, you'll be able to get it as a home console. And it's the exact same hardware as the arcade. But
who would buy it? Who would buy? I mean, the 600.
If you had enough money, you could. And there were people who had enough money. The people who ended up buying this, the few people I knew or had heard of, were typically people either very, very early 20s. They were the people who had guys who had, and I'm going to be sexist here, but let's face it, was guys. Who had that spare income, had that excess cash, from their first job or something, no family obligations, and they just wanted to have the latest and greatest and highest tech stuff they could get their hands on. And the first batch of games were not all that great. It takes a little while before they really, really get super good. And at the same time, they never really get too many games that are specific for the home version. They are always going to be arcade games, which means that you're really kind of stuck with fighting games and stuff that kills you a lot right up front, which, has its limitations.
But now I understand why it would be a rental only in the beginning of the thing.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it was something to showcase the system, and when it does come out, it never moves big numbers. It's always a very small percentage of the market, but the software existed anyway because they were going to release it in the arcade as it was. And
I can totally see how you would rent this thing out for a birthday party or something like that.
That's actually kind of a cool idea. I never even thought about that, but you're right. Yeah, you would rent it out for parties or something. Yeah, that makes sense. And have the arcade in your living room for a night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can totally see that. So at first I was wondering why you would have a console on a rental base, but considering that, totally makes sense.
Oh, console rentals were a huge deal throughout this entire period. You would go to the video store and rent a console, and Nintendo fought that too. Oh my God, they fought that. Actually, I'm already almost done with the research for next month, but there was a story, I didn't bother bringing it up, but Nintendo at this point is still fighting the battle against Blockbuster Video, the biggest rental video chain, because of them photocopying the manuals to NES games that they're renting out. Because that photocopying is a violation of the copyright. So they had already failed to win the battle against rentals of games, but they did actually succeed in the battle that you couldn't copy the manuals. So now if somebody rented the game, they had to rent it without the manual.
Of course, because those guys who rented it away were too afraid that those manuals were being destroyed in the rental process.
Exactly. And they were. I mean, it was wear and tear. And the problem is that games back then didn't necessarily have the same tutorial style levels that we have in games today. So you know how the first level of each game nowadays is basically take you by the hand and teach you all the moves and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You didn't have that back then.
No, you didn't.
No.
My first console was a Super Nintendo, but even those consoles did not have, well, most games did not have a tutorial level.
Exactly. So the manual could be of great use, especially if you only rented it for one night or 2 nights.
Oh, yeah. Oh, also they often
You're losing time.
stories in them, and some even were like books.
Oh, yeah. I mean, manuals back then, for console games, they typically weren't that much. But you occasionally had the manuals that had, like more background story or gave you the idea of how the world worked and stuff like that.
Oh, man, I still remember this manual to Empire Earth. I mean, of course, it wasn't 1990. It was way later. But
and it wasn't a console game.
It wasn't a console game. Yep, but still, the manual, it was a book, and you get the background information to any of those civilizations that were in the game. Like, every civilization had like a 2 or 3 pager about it. It was, geez, that was history lesson in form of a game. That was cool.
Yeah. One of my favorite manuals, if I want to call it that, was for Wings. CinemaWare's Wings actually included an entire book, a paperback book, which was a history of aviation in World War I. Mm-hmm. They just threw it into the box. It was great.
Just because they could. Awesome.
Yeah. And I mean, other great manuals, yeah.
They put really a whole lot of love in it, and then I was so disappointed when manuals became part of the CD as you could look at it PDF file.
Yeah,
which I never did.
What's the point of that? You're supposed to have the manual with you as you're watching the screen, right? And the only time that makes the PDF never made sense to me. What made sense was the integration of the tools for learning how to play the game inside the game. Assassin's Creed, the Assassin's Creed series is the perfect example of this, where they have the historical information integrated into the game as you encounter it.
Yeah.
And that makes so much more sense, because giving me a list of all the famous places I will see in a manual doesn't help me. I'm not going to read through them one after the other, but getting the context through the game makes a lot more sense. Right. And so there are ways of doing that, of getting that information into the game that is interactive, that is so much better than the manual. But at the time, back then, when the manual was the only way to do it, that totally made sense. And so, yeah, I mean, but we're digressing. We're getting off on tangents, and we should be talking about the next best console that's coming out on the market.
Console that's coming out, and this is the GX4000 being on its way.
While Amstrad hasn't confirmed anything, Ace Magazine has been talking to game developers that have spilled the beans. Amstrad will be launching a souped-up version of the CPC 8-bit computer as a console. Talk is of 2 megabit, aka 256K cartridges for the games. An official announcement wouldn't come until August, with the official launch being in September. The systems would sadly fail pretty miserably and be discontinued the next year. So
yeah, I've never heard of it.
Yeah, okay. So just to give you a little bit of background, Amstrad is an English company. Alan Sugar, Sir Alan Sugar, famous entrepreneur. He got his start with hi-fi systems and stuff, and he would basically sell cheap, high-end electronics. That was his bread and butter. And in the 80s, he also got into the computer business.
Yeah.
had sort of the also-ran computer in England, the Amstrad CPC, which was a Z80-based system that was in some architectural structures similar to the Spectrum, but had some really great graphic capabilities, big color palette and stuff. But a lot of software didn't take advantage of it because the market was relatively small for the machine, and it was easier to just port the Spectrum game over one-to-one. But because it wasn't using the graphics, even though the machine was more powerful, it typically ran slower than the Spectrum version. And so it was basically a system plagued by cheap ports. And this GX4000 was part of a move by Alan Sugar. I think it was like he wanted to do something like introduce one new product every week or something for a year. It was a weird setup. And this was pushed out in a similar vein to what we talked about last month with Commodore releasing the GS64, which was a Commodore 64 torn out of the keyboard housing and thrown into a console housing. And the difference is the GX4000 has a little bit more thought put into it. It is a souped up version of the CPC, and just recently a whole bunch of people have finally been exploiting it and making some really amazing games for this GX4000, including a port of Pinball Dreams, 16-bit pinball simulation that had this beautiful scrolling. So as the ball would go up and down the field, it would scroll with it beautifully on the Amiga. And they have ported that to the GX4000, and it looks gorgeous. So the system had a ton of potential. It's just it never had the market share that would have justified the investment in software development. If you go online and check the demo scene for the GX4000, there's just some gorgeous stuff, and you're like, wow, almost kind of a wasted opportunity. But then again, it's coming out at the same time as the Genesis is hitting North America. The Genesis has already been out in Japan for over a year at this point. By the time the GX4000 comes out, it's shortly before the launch in Europe, and so it's too little, too late. But yeah,
I get the feeling that today is going to be a console wars episode.
There's a lot of console-based stuff in this episode, but don't worry, there's so much more too. But yes, let's stick with consoles for a little while.
Yeah. Moving on, Sega expands Master System licenses to European companies.
Oh, that's right. Now, back in our November 2018 episode, that was our first one, we talked about how Sega had finally allowed third parties to publish games for the Master System in the US. This was, of course, in the shadow of the Japanese launch of the Mega Drive. Well, now they have finally brokered deals with England's US Gold, which will be porting Gauntlet and Mission Impossible to Sega's aging 8-bit system. Mirrorsoft will be releasing Back to the Future 2 and Speedball, while Titus is bringing Fire and Forget 2 to the system. Given the system's popularity in Europe that will still hold on for a few more years, this licensing strategy ensures a healthy, if not always qualitatively great, supply of new software for the next few years. Yes, so I guess here we really need to put it in perspective. Europe at this point is not a console-rich market. The only console that has really made any dent is the Master System. And because the Japanese are primarily pushing hardware in their home market and in North America, it's going to take a while before they have enough excess production that they can really supply the European market. And so all the consoles at this point are coming out very, very late in Europe. And so they had a vested interest in keeping the older systems alive longer here, especially Sega. And since Sega didn't have any major software support in the United States, other than for Activision porting some games, they needed to find new publishers because the Master System had pretty much been a very distant also ran in Japan. You could argue third place after the NES and the PC Engine. So there were virtually no Japanese developers willing to put serious money into the system. So getting European publishers who were also going to be the ones profiting from this and who hopefully understood the local market better just made more sense than anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of these games sucked. I mean, Fire and Forget 2 was terrible. Back to the Future 2 had some interesting ideas, but very poor implementation.
And the name, because it was a movie licensed game, and those are mostly hardly any good.
Yeah, I mean, it has some great ideas. Back to the Future 2, had it been developed by a better team, I believe it was developed by Tiertex, which tells you, if you've ever heard that name before, you know the game is going to suck balls. Now,
but they're surely a cheap team because they have to pay so much for the license up front that
no. Now, Tiertex is the developer.
The game itself.
No, Tiertex is the developer. The licensor, the one who paid the license, is the publisher. So the way this would work is that the publisher would pay money for the license and then hire a team to develop the game.
Well, this is what I mean. And this team does get a whole lot of money because you already spent so much on the license.
This is probably true, but still, Tiertex, I mean, was notoriously bad. I mean, they did things like the home computer ports of Street Fighter, and yeah, those are hard. Those are hard to look at, hard to try to play. I mean, they also did the home versions of Strider, which were pretty dire. I mean, they were often given little to work with and in almost insurmountable odds, but it was just for the most part bad. So these are not great, but it is interesting to note that Sega is trying to keep the 8-bit system alive in the European market. And the fact that they waited so long to allow third-party publishing on the system really was a strategic mistake that they did not make with the Mega Drive.
Yeah.
But, okay. And talking about turning profits.
Yeah, Atari turns a profit.
1988 was a bad year for Atari Corporation. The computer guys, that is. Remember, we got Atari Games. Those are the arcade guys with Tengen, and Atari Corporation is Jack Tramiel. With $97 million in losses in 88. But 1989 saw them make a profit of $5.8 million. Jack Tramiel's company was being held back by the Federated Group, an electronics retail chain that they purchased in 1987 that has racked up $106.3 million in losses in 1988. Federated's sale in 1989 got rid of that millstone around the company's neck. There was an FBI investigation into Atari's use of the store chain as a way to launder DRAM chips into the U.S. and bypass the U.S. restrictions that led to the 89 chip shortage, which we've talked about in previous episodes. This investigation was not picked up by prosecutors, even though the FBI investigation seems to have gathered some very damning evidence. So
the profit basically just was because of them selling this Federated Group.
Well, not just them selling the Federated Group, but also no longer having to book the losses from the Federated Group.
Okay.
Yeah, so Federated was a big electronics retailer on the West Coast, and they were infamous for very crazy ads. And I've added a link to some of their ads in the show notes, so please check those out. If you've never seen a Federated Group ad before, they're just bizarre beyond belief. And they bought them primarily, and again, listen to our Michael Katz interview. He talks about the whole Federated situation as he was at Atari when this was going down. Trammell buys Federated. And for those who have been listening to our show for a long time, one of our early episodes, we talked about how Jack Trammell back in the late 70s tried to buy Lafayette, also an electronics retailer, because he wanted to incorporate that into his then company, Commodore. And the idea here was that Jack Trammell had burned so many bridges with retailers back with the VIC-20 that nobody wanted to really work with him anymore. And so the only way to sell the Atari ST, his computer at the time, was to get his own retail chain. So he was going to try to sell the Atari ST through Federated as a way to get it onto the market. And that did not work because they only got Federated because Federated was already going broke, because Federated had no future. And when they did take it, because the Trammells had no experience in retail, they really didn't know how to run a retail business, and the whole thing just got worse. And this idea of the laundering the DRAM chips into the U.S., I tried to do the research into it. I've got links to the stories about this and in the show notes, and it's definitely worth checking out. But apparently, and this is a very brief summary, apparently what they tried to do was claim that the stuff coming in was inventory that had already been previously purchased by Federated, and they were then laundering it through Federated and then moving it to Atari's own own distribution network, and then selling it out into the public. So basically what was happening was they were trying to move it through so many shells that the government couldn't tell that these were new DRAMs that they were purchasing from overseas against the embargo, and selling them at elevated prices in the U.S. And I don't know why they didn't prosecute. It looks like they could have, but my suspicion is that the whole chip embargo fiasco that the government had initiated over the Japanese dumping, people just wanted to be done with it. It had not worked out the way everybody wanted to. It had caused this massive influx in the prices. And at the end of the day, I don't think anybody wanted to be reminded of how the government had screwed up. So the prosecutors just abandoned any attempt to bring charges, because it would have taken at least a year or so for those charges to go to a jury. And by then, it would have been old news, and it would have just brought back into the headlines that the government had screwed this up. So that's just my read on it.
This is a long-ass story, man.
Okay. Oh, you have no idea. I got lost for like 3 days going down this rabbit hole. I mean, there are leaked FBI reports out there and stuff. I literally got way too deep into this one, and then I decided, you know what? I don't want to go too deep into this.
I have a wife, I have a kid, I have a life. I should just stop right now, or else I'm gonna lose everything.
What can I say? I have an unhealthy obsession with everything Jack Trammell related, and this was just one more myth to throw on the pile of Jack Trammell stories. So, yeah, what can I say? Yeah, fascinating character, and this was just one more legend. So, okay. And speaking of the chip shortage,
yes, U.S. memory shuts down.
1989 saw a crisis in the chip market. As we talked about back in our April 2019 ep 1 year ago, the memory chip shortage put a lot of companies in a bind. The demand for lower-end chips surged, while demand for the larger chips didn't materialize fast enough. Then the U.S. government got involved over Japanese dumping prices, and the whole mess became, well, a mess. A consortium of American manufacturers created U.S. Memories, a new chip maker that was supposed to ensure American sourcing for chips to prevent foreign manufacturers from ever being able to put the industry in a bind again. Well, a year later, $30 chips are back down to $10, and the size of chips seems to be going up exponentially, with larger and larger capacity chips ensuring that competition will prevent price gouging in the future. It didn't help that the consortium was asking the companies involved to invest $500 million to get the company up and producing. A last-minute attempt to raise a mere $150 million hit a wall in January, ending the consortium for good. And yeah, so this was also a part of the story I had never heard of before until I ran across a notice on it. If you go into the show notes, there's a whole bunch of links about the history of this and how it panned out. Interesting attempt to kind of create a national producer of chips in the United States, but ultimately chip development had gotten so good so fast, and the rise of the ever expandable PC as opposed to the fixed architecture keyboard-based systems that had come before meant that you no longer had a long-term stable market for any particular type of chip. Okay, so so for example, an Amiga, you had the same chips in it from 1985 until they discontinued it in 1990. Well, probably had different chips in the AGA machines, but at least until 91, 92. But the PC would never have done that. You just basically kept upgrading the type of chips, and that was it. So that change in the market finally hit this market and finally changed the way that the chip market functioned, because now it was about what's the coolest chip this week and let's go for it.
Okay.
Yeah. So the endless upgrade cycle for your PC has had an effect or something.
This is why I should go to console. Anyhow, in your face PC Master Race. Anyhow, speaking of PC, yeah, and DLC, Madden gets updated roster data disc.
In a precursor move to the yearly update ritual that would become the hallmark of the Madden football series, EA has announced the National Football League Players Association Players Disc that will add the actual teams and players of the 1987 and 1988 seasons to the existing Madden game.
This is basically what's being done to FIFA.
Well, to all of these games.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
You want to play with the actual roster, but...
Well,
yeah.
and the thing is, you want to play with the real players. And the original Madden didn't have the players in it. It had the teams, but it didn't have the players. And it may not even have had the team names, just the team cities.
Okay.
And the only thing that they hadn't come up with yet was the idea that they were going to sell you a whole new game. They're just selling you a data disc.
Well, isn't it the same?
Oh, no. The data disc would be less than half the price of the game.
Yeah, of course. You can make more money with like selling it as a new game, putting a new logo on it, and it still being the same.
Well, you also have to remember that idea doesn't happen because of the PC version of Madden. That happens because of the console version of Madden.
Ooh, in my face, console player.
Exactly. Well, remember, console at this time is cartridge-based. How are you going to do a data disc add-on for a cartridge? You couldn't.
Not at all. Yeah.
Not at all at this point. I mean, so the only way that you're going to be able to update the roster is update the whole game, and the only way you're going to get somebody to pay for $60 for updated roster is to also upgrade the game a little bit.
Mhm.
And so it's with the Genesis port of Madden that we start to get the yearly updates. And it's basically a limitation of the cartridge. I think had they had the option of doing a data disk add-on, they probably wouldn't have done it as often as they did. Or if you'd already had online support to download those into some kind of save state, they probably wouldn't have done it. But the cartridge format didn't give you another option.
Right, and now that they got everyone used to having to buy a game every year, I mean, I'm not doing that bull crap, but there are people who do, and now they don't like change it back, because right now you can just download the new roster via an update, and you're good to go.
Exactly. And
for free, where people are willing to pay like 69 euros, dollars for it.
Exactly. But, I mean, hey, for some people, they only play that one game. So they're literally buying one game a year. And for them, it makes sense.
Yeah, for them, it totally makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I had a flatmate who bought the new FIFA every year. But yeah, you're right. It was the only game he played.
Exactly. So then it's not a problem, because if you're going to play that one game all year round, cool. More power to you. But yeah, it is just it was an innovative new step, especially as far as the licensing was concerned. And yeah, so there we go. And our final story for April of 1990.
Yes, Super Mario Ice Capades.
Ace Magazine reports that there is a Super Mario Bros. On Ice show in the USA. Now, this wasn't 100% true. It was a one-off segment of a TV show built around the Ice Capades. But if you want to see a late 80s Alyssa Milano and Jason Bateman doing some of their worst acting ever as hosts, and Mr. Belvedere do green face as King Koopa, well, while singing about being evil, this is the schlock for you. And I've included a link to this. I did not know that this existed before I saw this. I thought...
You feel enriched by now, knowing it exists?
I've tried to watch it 3 times. 3 times I've sat down trying to watch this.
Uh-huh.
I can't get through it. It is that unbelievably bad. Yeah.
Super Mario isn't so lucky with stuff that's not a game.
I guess the TV show worked. The cartoon show worked. But yeah, this it's clearly targeting the 6 and under crowd. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate it for that, I guess, but it's just so bad. It is so terribly, terribly bad. Like I said, if you're stuck at home and you're social distancing and you got a bottle of tequila, go for it. It can't be that bad under those circumstances. So, yeah. Okay.
So if you really want to feel lonely and sad, just go for it. All right.
Something like that. Okay, so that concludes our 30-year jump. Let's turn on the time machine and jump back to April of 2000.
Jump forward.
Yeah, that. Jump forward. Hey, we've already mentioned I'm retired, okay?
As an
industry, video games is bigger than Hollywood.
Y2 electronic launch in history.
Welcome to April of 2000.
It's midnight. You really want to do it right now?
Yeah, fuck it, let's do it. I'm gonna bleep the fuck.
All right.
As an industry, video games is bigger than Hollywood.
Y2 electronic launch in history.
Welcome in April 2000. Our first topic today, PS2 launches in Japan.
On March 4th, the PS2 hit the streets of Japan. The console would end up selling 1.4 million units by the end of the month in the land of the rising sun. The North American launch was still a ways away in October, with a European launch set for November.
Oh yeah, the PS2 wasn't the console that with the highest selling number, was it? Wasn't it?
Yes,
like
it is still the highest selling console in history.
Yeah. It's incredible.
And it was an incredible machine. I mean, when it came out, it could do things.
Yeah, 158 million machines worldwide.
Yeah, it's insane. It's a... Let's put it this way. The modern gaming scene as we know it today is born on the PS2. The open world game is only possible on the PS2 at its launch. Even high-end PCs of the time struggled with it. Now, granted, the PC would pick up and catch up within a year or two, but still, I mean, the PS2 was a revelation.
Right.
And it also made DVD popular. We cannot forget, without the PS2, you probably don't get the DVD revolution. So, wonderful, wonderful piece of kit. But it's not the only next-gen kit on the block.
Not. Speaking about consoles, the Xbox is finally revealed.
Long speculated, as we mentioned back in our October 2019 episode, Microsoft has finally revealed the Xbox at the Game Developers Conference. An impressive beast powered by a P3 clocked at 600 megahertz, 64 megs of RAM, 8 gigabyte hard drive, and a DVD drive make this a real powerhouse that on paper will be able to go toe-to-toe with the PS2. The final spec would actually be a 733 megahertz P3, but who's counting when you got that fancy NVIDIA GeForce 3 based GPU on board?
And this weird-ass controller that you cannot for the hell of it hold in your hands.
What are you talking about, you tiny little handed person? The Duke. The Duke is the greatest controller ever made. It is the only controller I can play with for hours and hours on end without getting a cramp in my hand.
Okay, and for all the normal people out there...
Hey! If you're not 6'4", what are you doing? No, as a person who's 6'4", I can tell you, the Duke is the greatest controller of all time. Period. Bar none. That's all there is to it. That thing is a beaut.
Beast.
Also a beaut, but a beast too. It was a little big. Come on. But if you put a DualShock controller, a PlayStation 2 DualShock controller in your hand, I'm sorry, but after about 4 hours, those little handlebars are going to start feeling kind of cramped.
Did you ever have a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con in your hand? This is what's going to make your hand cramp.
Oh, no. Jesus. No. Okay, Nintendo has not been able to get a decent controller built in quite a while. The GameCube controller was an utter mess. The Switch controller is just way too small for my hands. Obviously the handhelds are the handhelds. You
might have enjoyed the Wii U gamepad.
The Wii U gamepad. You mean the tablet wannabe that you had? Yeah. Okay. Whatever. Yeah. The Wii U. We're not even going to discuss the Wii U here.
No, because it's not here yet. Now we're talking about something else from Nintendo. Nintendo does what everyone knew they would. Delay the Dolphin and the Game Boy Advance.
Okay, so the rosy expectations of a 2000 release of the Dolphin, aka GameCube console, wasn't much of a surprise. But the fact that the Game Boy Advance, the new handheld system, is delayed to 2001 as well, is no doubt in no small part due to the amazing success of Pokemon and its ability to keep selling Game Boy and Game Boy Color hardware like gangbusters. The GBA would debut in the summer, and the GameCube would hit stores by Christmas in North America. So, we've talked about this several times now over the last couple months. Nintendo kept trying to claim that they were going to be a factor in the year 2000 on the market, probably in the hopes of convincing consumers to hold off on buying either a PS2 or a Dreamcast or even maybe an Xbox. But the reality is that the retailers who are going to be purchasing for Christmas are going to be putting in their orders around March and April.
Yeah.
And so they couldn't keep pretending it was going to be there without having to admit defeat to the retailers.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what happened. And I think it was really to buy time against Sega in the Christmas period in the hopes that people would be like, well, if I just wait one more year, I can get the new Nintendo product. And those old Sega Nintendo 16-bit rivalries, those were what they were playing at. They were hoping that the people who were teenagers or kids back then would say, yeah, I was a Sega kid and maybe I should buy the Dreamcast. And they're like, hey, Nintendo's got this fancy new thing coming out and blah, blah, blah. But the reality check came and the GameCube is delayed. And the Game Boy Advance, the only reason I can see them having delayed it is not because of the hardware. It's just, if the Game Boy is still selling so good, why would you bother releasing new hardware? Yeah.
Well, thanks to Pokemon.
Exactly.
Nice little guys. Other than Conker, because Conker is no longer a nice guy.
No. Rare's often delayed 3D action-adventure title Conker, which was originally supposed to be a kid-friendly game, has apparently taken a turn. Finally shown off to the press at a junket promoting Perfect Dark, another Rare game, Conker's Bad Fur Day, not the original title, is now apparently a raunchy, M-rated, tongue-in-cheek adventure for the grown-up-ish. The game was supposed to be out in time for Christmas, but would get pushed back to March of 2001 and be the final game released for the N64 in North America. So, yes. Did you ever play Conker?
No.
You never played Conker's Bad Fur Day?
There was 10 by then in Germany. Forget it.
Oh, man. Okay, I can only say that the only game I've ever completed on the N64, and
Okay.
I admit I played it through emulation, but the only game I ever completed was Conker's Bad Fur Day. It is so funny. It is so well made. It's fully voice recorded on an N64, which, given that it's a cartridge game, is amazing. Sound quality is not always great, but it still works. And just the sheer audacity of some of the stuff they pull off in the game is amazing. There's dirty sexual innuendo, which doesn't end up being innuendo at all. There's the worst, middle school type jokes about poo. There's a scene where it's literally the storming the beach in Normandy, but with cute furry creatures blowing each other up. I mean,
Oh, Lord.
the game is just amazing on every conceivable level and does things that you'd never expect, but it does become the final North American release for the N64 shortly before or shortly after the GameCube's launch. So, but definitely, I mean, if you ever get a chance, there was also a remake of it for the Xbox because Rare got bought by Microsoft.
Yeah.
But that one, they edited out certain elements, so it's not quite the same game anymore. But yeah, that original N64 game I can only recommend it to everybody.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
Something to try out.
Exactly. Now, other games that are taking new turns.
Yes, and not just being remade. Final Fantasy is going online.
Square, the venerable RPG making studio, has held its own convention, Millennium, in Yokohama, and they debuted trailers for not one, but 3 new Final Fantasy titles. Final Fantasy IX would see a return to classic Final Fantasy design aesthetics on the PSX. Final Fantasy X, the first PS2 entry into the series, which will also feature online strategy guides and use an aesthetic more reminiscent of Final Fantasy VII and VIII. And finally, Final Fantasy XI, which will be an online-only game. Not only will this bring new gameplay to consoles, but it will also be released for Windows and allow for cross-platform play. The game would continue to see expansions released for it for several years after its 2002 release, including a port to the Xbox 360 in 2006. So, this is kind of, in some ways you might say, the apex of Square's JRPG dominance. Which the PlayStation was really the platform that made the JRPG a household concept in the West. Mm-hmm. They had existed since the NES days, but on the PlayStation is where they find their home, with Final Fantasy VII really leading the way. And they never really have the same power in the next generation. The games keep coming out for the PS2, but they get overshadowed by games like Tony Hawk and Grand Theft Auto. And so this is the height of their power, the fact that they're having their own convention just for this one developer shows you how big it is. And there's indications in the articles about it that it's supposed to become like a yearly event, but as far as I can tell, it only happens once. And Final Fantasy IX is a huge success, but doesn't hit the same heights as the previous games. Final Fantasy X also is not quite as big as some of the previous games. And Final Fantasy XI, that one keeps going for forever. I think the servers are still running to this day.
Okay. I don't know. I never really got into the Final Fantasy franchise. Reason.
Yeah, I mean, I was never a huge fan of the mechanics. I hate the walking around a field and hitting a random encounter. Annoyed the hell out of me. I wanted a little bit more concise storytelling, or at least gameplay.
You're a Pokemon fan, aren't you?
What?
You're also no Pokemon fan, aren't you?
I'm not a Pokemon fan. I tried it, and I was just a little too old for that. The random encounter battles always annoyed me. I did play through Final Fantasy I, the GBA version of it, years ago just to have that experience, but I've never really gone back. I tried Final Fantasy VI and the semi-real-time combat system with the clock running at the same time. So it wasn't 100% turn-based, but it wasn't 100% real-time either. And I'll be honest, it just annoyed the hell out of me to the point where after about 3 hours, I just dropped it and never went back. Even though I found the plot lines interesting and I would have liked to see where the story was going, I just didn't want to deal with the combat system anymore. So, that's just me. I'm Give me either 100% turn-based tactical combat or give me an action RPG, but please don't try to mix the two together. It's not a Reese's Peanut Butter Cup. It's not two great flavors mixed together. But that's just me. What can I say? There's a lot of people who love it, and more power to you if you do. And speaking of changing the way things are done, more power for me now. The way things are done.
Okay, Fallout 3 goes 3D.
Now, this is not the Fallout 3 that Bethesda would release in 2008. This was the game codenamed Van Buren that was in development when Interplay finally succumbed to its serious financial trouble. And for more on that, you can go back and listen to our June 2019 episode when we talked about Titus buying a 30% stake in Interplay. The game would be canceled, the Van Buren game. Bethesda would use parts of the game's setting for their own version of Fallout 3, but a fully new engine with a first-person perspective would be used. So, are you
stick to it up to this day?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's kind of what Bethesda does nowadays, especially after the acquisition of id. But did you ever play Fallout 1 or 2?
Nah.
Okay, they were isometric perspective RPGs.
Yeah, and I've seen some screenshots of them, but yeah, also the Fallout franchise is something I didn't really get into.
Really? Don't like the post-apocalypse?
No, not really.
Have you seen Mad Max Fury Road?
Yes, actually I have.
Did you enjoy it?
To be honest, those are the movies that I watch next to something that I have to do for, back in the day when I was at university and I had to write some paper which I wasn't really interested in, but it had to be written anyway, so I had turned on the Netflix or whatever and watched Mad Max and,
No. Well, not the old 80s ones. I'm talking Mad Max Fury Road, the one that came out about 5 years ago.
King Mad Max Fury Road.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Oh, yeah. It was just something that ran on the side.
Oh, dude, no, you got to sit down and really take that movie in. It's a piece of art. But
Maybe.
But okay, I'm a child of the 80s. For me, everything was post-apocalypse. If it was Blade Runner, or if it was Juggers, or if it was Mad Max, or any of these other post-apocalypse style films, that was kind of, the fiction I grew up on. So Fallout 1 and 2 I loved, and this version of Fallout 3, the previews for it always looked good. It was supposed to continue the isometric style perspective, but now with a fully realized 3D engine.
So we all have our own kind of nostalgia. For you, it's a dystopian post-apocalyptic setting, and for me, it's furry animals called Pokemon.
That you basically capture out of the wild and then forced to fight against each other for your amusement.
Yeah, slavery, but in Mad Max, you're the one who's being touched by the system, and in Pokemon, I'm, it's like the other way around.
Okay, so one of ours tells us a moral lesson about finding a way to compromise and work together unless you don't want to live in a wasteland of death and destruction. And yours is...
You don't know what's going on in the Pokeball, so this fits both things.
And in your version, it's... you will get rewarded for animal cruelty. Okay, I see where this is going. Okay. Oh my God, your generation is.
I'm telling yourself it's friendship, man.
And also telling yourself that evolution happens within the same entity as opposed to over generations.
Oh yeah, but still they're way inferior than I am because I'm the master. It might be a big-ass dragon, it still listens to what I'm saying to it.
I still wonder how many kids got bitten by dogs because they thought they could train them like a Pokemon.
What do you mean? But they just weren't the best trainers, man.
Oh, yeah, that's it. Okay, enough about that.
And moving on.
Yes.
Origin. Origin shuts down the Ultima 9 boards.
Ultima 9 launched back in November of 1999 to very mixed reviews, with those that saw it as an amazing RPG milestone introducing the first truly open-world 3D experience, while others couldn't get past the fact that the tech side was a mess and that it shipped in an all but unplayable state. Well, Origin, the publisher, which belonged to EA by this point, has decided that after the release of the third patch to the game, it was finished, and thus the official U9 forums on their website could be shut down. Of course, the bugs were not even close to being ironed out, and to this day many malign the title. So this is interesting that
you guys complaining about it anymore. Shut up.
exactly. We don't want anything that's official press. They didn't take down the website; they just took down the forums.
Yeah.
So you could still go to the website, see the wonderful screenshots, and that. I mean, the game never truly gets bug fixed completely. And you can buy it on GOG today. Apparently it works, but it's one of those things that and we've talked about it on the show before, but it was one of those games that got stuck during development in that phase between 3D accelerated and non-3D accelerated. Now, it had a ton of other problems, too, where they basically had to rewrite almost the entire story at the last minute and stuff like that. But I think a lot of the technical problems just stemmed from the fact that it was not originally going to be a 3D accelerated game. Then they had to add the 3D acceleration, and then while they were doing that, it went from being a 3D effects dominated world to a direct 3D dominated world, and it just was one reworking too far, and EA just pushed it out the door. And it didn't really work for anybody properly. And yes, such ends the Ultima lineage of games, sadly, that it went all the way back to the late 70s. And sad. But
true.
this is true.
Oh, man. Alright, moving on, because it's not... Well, it is early again. Protesters go after Midway.
Midway, the venerable coin-op company makers of the Mortal Kombat franchise, found themselves the center of a new controversy in January when a group of religious protesters showed up in City Hall in Chicago, the company's headquarters, and at a local Toys R Us to protest the fact that the city had offered the company a $2.2 million grant to keep them in Chicago. They were planning on moving, and according to the city's mayor, would have cost the city 700 jobs.
Oh, sure. Throw some money after Midway.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a very typical thing, especially in the States, where everybody's competing against everybody. They're all trying to get some kind of tax break or whatever in order to stay in one place as an incentive. And this was an incentive to keep Midway in Chicago, which Chicago was the traditional hub of the pinball industry, going all the way back to practically the turn of the century. And they were one of the last companies still there after everybody else, all the video stuff had been moved to California. So, yeah, and so they got protested. It didn't make any difference. They got the money, and they stayed in Chicago.
Good for them.
Yay! But yeah, these groups were all protesting not because they thought the money was wrong, but that their taxpayer money was going to support these evil people who made violent video games.
The devil.
The devil made him do it, yes.
Yeah.
But let's go back to more earthly pursuits and talk about some company news.
Oh yeah, Cave Dog is gone, but Chris Taylor is hitting it big.
Last month, we closed on the story of Cave Dog, a development house started by Ron Gilbert that just shuttered its doors. The only title it ended up releasing were the real-time strategy series Total Annihilation by Chris Taylor. Taylor left a while back to form Gas-Powered Games, and their first title, Dungeon Siege, has just been announced to be published by Microsoft. And, I mean, this isn't huge news. Gas-Powered Games does play a role for a while in the industry. I just really, really enjoyed Dungeon Siege back in the day, and I thought I wanted to mention it again. So, I really like Dungeon Siege. Sorry, simple answer. But yeah, fun game, great multiplayer, very straightforward. Action game and action role-playing game. Well, action game with inventory management, if you will. But it introduced a really cool feature where your skills were based on the actions you took. So it's not like you leveled up and had points to distribute. If you wanted to get better at the sword, you had to keep using swords. So every time you hit with a sword...
I was just trying to remember. I think I've played Dungeon Siege 2.
Yeah, Dungeon Siege 2 was okay, but it was kind of broken if you knew Dungeon Siege 1 due to the way it handled the pack animals. Because the pack animals became a key feature, and I can't remember what it was, but I think they limited the number of pack animals you could have or the number of people you could have in the party, at least on the first playthrough in Dungeon Siege 2, and it kind of broke the balance of the game. So it wasn't just about hoarding and grabbing stuff anymore. You had to constantly be dropping stuff behind you because you didn't have enough storage capacity.
Oh yeah,
and that just took the fun out of it. The original Dungeon Siege was just run in and kill everything, and then you had these spells where you just converted your leftover stuff to gold, and that was it. And they got rid of that for Dungeon Siege 2, and it slowed the game down dramatically.
In Dungeon Siege 2, I remember dragging around a whole lot of donkeys with me.
Yeah, but you didn't have as many people in the party.
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
I just had a whole lot of donkeys to put my stuff on.
Yeah, and I couldn't remember exactly what it was, but it was either less people in the party or the donkeys. There was something about the donkeys. And I tried playing it, and I just didn't have as much fun as I had with the first one. Yeah, the first one is just really, really fast. It's constant movement, constant stuff happening. And that just felt right. But, alas. Okay.
Keep moving, man. Speaking of things moving through, Infograms go through another COO.
Stan Roach, former marketing head of the company, who had been raised to the position of COO of Infogrames North America after Jim Barnett got the boot, has now also been canned. Apparently, the strategy of buying up a bunch of companies on the verge of collapse isn't giving them the amazing profits they had hoped for.
Well, who would have thought?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've talked about this several times now. Infogram has been on this path of buying up companies like GT Interactive and so forth that were already collapsing, but because they had all this French stock market money because of a stock bubble in media companies at the time, they just wanted to expand, and they didn't know, they weren't being very thoughtful with their acquisitions. And the problem is that the companies that they purchase end up having lots of debt, lots of infrastructure, lots of overhead, but very little in the way of really good product in the pipeline or development talent, and it ends up killing them. They had also previously purchased Accolade as their first U.S. acquisition, then GT Interactive. This gave them a big distribution network, but it did not give them any product to put into that distribution channel.
Yeah, Well, true. There's a reason why companies were broke.
This is very true. Well, I mean, in a way they still exist today, but that's a long story that we will continue to chronicle month by month here on the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
Foreshadowing again.
Exactly.
Okay, then, moving on. 3DFX cuts 20% of its workforce.
After the ousting of Greg Ballard, which we talked about on our December episode, new CEO Alex Leupp, L-E-U-P-P, don't know how to pronounce that, a veteran engineer and member of the board, has started his tenure by spinning off the Special Technologies Group, which was in charge of making specialized software for workstations and eliminating 20% of the staff of the company, some of which will be through the spinning off of STG and part through redundancies. So, this STG's section was there for using the 3DFX technology for big pre-rendered workstations. So the machines that would make special effects for movies and things like that. And they're spinning that off in the hopes that that will become its own independent business. And that will also basically cut the payroll of the company by quite a bit. But like I mentioned with the EUO story, 3DFX was the standard for the industry. It is no longer the standard. Direct 3D is very quickly taking over, and their raison d'etre is gone as it was. It's very sad. I like their cards a lot. But all good things must come to an end.
This is true.
Especially when you make stupid decisions.
Exactly. Well, speaking about decisions, whether they're stupid or not, Hasbro is going to defend its Atari rights.
Hasbro, the toy company, has owned the home rights to many pre-1984 Atari classics due to their acquisition in 1998 of the Atari Corporation assets. Remember, Atari Corporation was Jack Tramiel's company. These rights, which include games like Tempest, Asteroids, and Breakout, which in 2000 were frequently the inspiration for Java-based browser games and shareware compilations, will no longer be left undefended, according to the toy maker. They plan on launching legal actions against the infringers, a tactic which would continue on to this day with the current rights holders. Curiously enough, the German magazine PC Player reviewed the official Atari Arcade Hits #1 collection this month, which had some great recreations as well as bonuses like interviews with Nolan Bushnell on it. They only gave the package 50%, though, saying that the ups were that you got 6 games and it had historical value, but the downside was that all of these games were available online for free. So you could definitely say that Hasbro has a point here. That if they paid for these rights, these games are intellectual property, and this rampant copying. Well, it's not that nobody bought it. It's just that it gets bad review scores and stuff because this stuff is available everywhere. If it's available for free, it has no more market value.
No.
And the fact that these games are so simple means that a lot of people were just creating them to train themselves. It was like, well, how do I learn how to make games? Well, I'll just copy one of these old one of these old games. Yeah. And they needed to do something to get control of that. I mean, just last week, and we're talking now here, April of 2020, they announced that there's going to be a Pong RPG.
What?
For example. Yeah, they're building an RPG where all the characters are Pong sticks and the combat system is based around Pong. It sounds bizarre, and I watched the trailer and I want to play this game so much now.
I just don't know how to respond to that, so...
Yeah, what can I say? I mean, it looks interesting. Whether or not it plays well, I don't know, but it looks interesting. And Hasbro is going to launch quite a few remakes. There's going to be a new Pong here in 2000 or 2001.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite good, actually. It's fun, but it does get boring after a while. These are very simple games. But they have historical value. They are easily recognizable, and they are very good for pick-up and play experiences.
Okay.
But Hasbro's video game division isn't going to be long for this world. So, they're going to start a few of these lawsuits, lots of cease and desists, but ultimately, it too will be purchased by Infogrames. But that's a story for the near future.
Yeah.
Okay.
And being
going
in the
into
past,
the end
as
stretch.
we are, a psychic sues Pokemon.
Psychic Uri Geller, famous for bending spoons with his mind, is suing Nintendo over the magic Pokemon character Kadabra. Now, what does this have to do with Geller? Well, Kadabra is a psychic and holds a spoon, and in Japanese, his name is Ungela. So he might have a bit of an argument, but his lawsuit seeking $100 million is just some very weak sauce attempt to get a payday. The court case was dismissed, but the Pokemon in question has not been reissued as a card since, although he continues to appear in other Pokemon products.
Yeah.
So while the Pokemon Corporation and Nintendo continue to use him, the rights holder for the card game basically hasn't dared to go down that road since, for fear that it would get him in trouble.
Okay. Dude, you're yawning a lot.
I know. Let's close this out. We got two more.
Two more, and one is Dream-related. EA buys up DreamWorks Interactive.
Oh, man, I'm sorry I interrupted. That was a nice setup you just made there. The dreams. I dig it. Okay, so the software division of Steven Spielberg's DreamWorks SKG that had made a name for itself with Medal of Honor, a good reputation, and Jurassic Park Trespasser, a really bad reputation, wasn't finding its footing within the larger DreamWorks infrastructure, and EA seized on the opportunity to take the studio over. The success of the Medal of Honor franchise that would continue development until 2013 and start the historic first-person shooter genre that would also spawn Activision's Call of Duty would keep the studio busy, but the cancellation of that franchise would lead to the studio being sold to DICE. So, yes. Interesting little side note here, the Medal of Honor was basically a side development at the same time that Steven Spielberg was doing Saving Private Ryan. So it kind of went hand in hand at the time. And if you've never seen Jurassic Park Trespasser, just look it up on YouTube. Oh my lord. Angry Video Game Nerd did a video on it as well, which is worth watching. It's, bad is no way to describe that game. Just plain broken is the only way to approach it. It's basically trying to do the physics engine of Half-Life 2, but a decade and a half earlier without the technical capabilities or the game design chops. It's bad. It's just bad.
Well, they tried.
Yeah, they did. But yeah, it's interesting to see where this studio went, and it's another one of those attempts of a movie studio trying to do interactive entertainment, and they're just two different disciplines. Yeah. And they shouldn't be put under one roof.
Nope.
No. Okay. And of course, DICE is the maker of the Battlefield series, so you can definitely see some of the DNA of Medal of Honor still surviving in DICE today. Okay, and our last story of the day.
Story for today. Freeloader.com is bringing free games to you.
An ever-increasing number of websites are trying to figure out how the web can be used for digital distribution of software. We saw how classic titles were being ported to Java and Macromedia Flash for use on websites back in our January episode, and in February we talked about the Back to the Roots site, which was trying to get legitimate download licenses to classic Amiga software. Well, UK developer Pure is releasing modern PC titles as free downloads on their site, freeloader.com. The games will include their own console game, Rat Attack, as well as Take-Two's Grand Theft Auto. How will they pay for this? Well, like all things on the web in the early 2000s, with advertising. And it went as well as one might expect, with them shutting down a year later as ad revenue on the website started to dry up. Yeah, so we're not talking today about the closure of a company, but it's close enough. Yeah, and I remember freeloader.com. I tried them out once. And yeah, everything took forever. It was slow. And yeah, it was just a pain. But it was just one of these many, many companies at the time that was trying to figure out how much you could do based solely on generating ad revenue.
Right, and it was a nice first attempt of a flat rate gaming service. I mean, you didn't pay; you paid by watching ads, surely, but still, it was a nice try.
It was a nice try. The idea was there, but yeah, I mean, the model that would be developed through Facebook of something where they're monitoring what you're doing and you're playing it constantly and connecting with other people, which basically spreads the game even more, and you're looking at ads while you're playing, wouldn't have worked here because these were games that were not originally designed for that type of interaction. Right. And so this is why, I mean, it couldn't succeed. But hey, they tried, and you got to give them credit for that. And some VCs, some venture capitalists put the money in for it, and hopefully at least the founders got a little bit of money out of it. So,
speaking of which,
yes.
Yeah, no. I don't dare in those times to ask for support because, dude, we are recording for what now? 3 hours?
Oh, something like that. Yeah. Who knows? I've lost track of time. It's all good. Peace, man. Peace. Yeah, okay. I think that concludes our episode. And yeah, there were also some corrections from last time, and I'm going to read those in later on. But yeah, that's pretty much it for us.
Wait. You're going to read those in later on. You know, when we bring out the podcast, this stuff that you want to read out later on is going to be at the beginning of the podcast.
I know. And if anybody actually sat through this podcast all the way to the end, congratulations. This was your inside look to see how the sausage is made. Shh. Don't tell anybody. But the intro headline at the top of the episode, those little 3 headlines, I haven't written them yet at the time of recording this. So
this is actually a first. So
that's true. It's all good. It's all good. It's the magic of editing. They know that it's not all done in one long streak with us almost passed out, or at least me almost passed out. No, that's not visible or hearable or whatever else. Okay, but hey, everybody, please leave a like on your podcast app of choice. It really does help us. We'd like to get some at some point. If you are one of those new people who have joined us after hearing the plug on the Retro Asylum and listen to the Michael Katz interview sections, hope you stick around, go back through the archive if you want, even though the first few episodes are kind of tough, and travel through the history of gaming news with us as we go through it month by month. It's a fun ride, trust me. And
Getting better.
it is definitely getting better, despite COVID. And if you do want to follow us on Twitter or Instagram, the links are down below. Patreon, of course, is there as well, but we understand under the circumstances it's kind of a bitchy thing to ask people to contribute to. And
on the other hand, some people now have time, so.
Well, this is true too. Some people have time, but they probably have less money than they have time. And be on the lookout for all the other great interviews that we've got coming up. We're desperately trying to use this extra time that we have to create as much content as possible for you. Peter, any final thoughts for our viewers, listeners? Something.
Dude, this is just before 1 a.m., so no.
Good.
I don't think anymore. I just react.
Exactly. And remember, everybody, the secret word is tobacco. Have fun.